All right, good afternoon and welcome to History 121. I want to talk about World War II today and especially want to talk about World War II at home. It's very popular. We have easy access to popular culture movies and books about the military aspect of the Second World War, but I really want to concentrate on what happens at home this week because I don't feel that we give enough credence and understanding to World War II on the home front. So, before I get started on that, I do want to say that we will be. It's my plan. I'll be getting your exams back to you by the end of the weekend. I apologize again. It takes a while to grade essay exams, and for those of you thinking about going into teaching, never schedule two exams in the same week. It makes things really fun. So I am working on that. I'll get those hopefully by the end of the weekend and back to you, as well as the Sanger papers, as quickly as possible after that. So let's go ahead and talk about World War II at home. After Pearl Harbor and the nature of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Americans quickly rallied to the need to support the government and the war effort in order to get America up to speed. One of the things that we'll see as we talk through the rest of this lecture, a make-do mentality really takes over um, how civilians handle the war at home. Remember, we're coming out of the Great Depression. We're coming out of a period where there is incredible amounts of unemployment. People are wary of spending money. They don't have a lot of money. Wages have been low. Work has been scarce. And so people continue this make do mentality. And what that make do mentality is when you wear a hole in your blue jeans, you patch them and continue to wear them. You hand down clothes. If your kids outgrow clothes, you save them so that your younger son can wear your older son's clothes. You save your money and you don't go out and spend it willy nilly on things. You cook at home, you garden, you preserve food. You really work on making do with making the best of what you have. And so that goes right hand in hand with how civilians are going to handle the war effort. You have to conserve resources. I'm trying to think of how to put this in a non-political manner. Essentially, the United States of America in the 21st century has had active military operations overseas for 15 years. At no point have we been asked to limit our driving or ration our food or given orders that we can only buy certain foods on certain days, that you couldn't get tires. There were just we haven't had products removed from the market because the resources needed to make them were needed for the military. That's what happened during the Second World War. We'll talk about that with rationing and scrap drives in just a bit. So we see a real push to conserve the resources you have. We also see increased employment because of the need to produce war materials. Again, this is something that we're not essentially used to in the wake of the Second World War, but prior to World War II, between World War I and World War II, the American military shrank down significantly. Before World War I, there had been maybe 100,000 men in the Army as a total. That ramped up to several million for World War I. After the war, we ramped back down the size of our military back down to a couple 100,000 people. All of a sudden, World War II, a truly global war fought on two fronts by the United States, calls for at least 6 to 10 million people to serve in the American military. And so we need to make uniforms, helmets, guns, ships, tanks, everything for the military because we don't have a standing military capable of fighting a war on two fronts in 1941. So we need to produce war materials that, and not only are we increasing the number of jobs out there in order to produce these goods, we're also taking that 6 to 10 million men and women out of the workforce, out of the unemployment pool, because they're needed in the military. They're not fighting other people for jobs. This is going to lead to an economic boon stateside. This is really what ends the Great Depression. The fact that we take millions of people out of the workforce, to serve in the military. We need millions of others at home to step in and find work in these new jobs in order to support the war effort. They're going to be paid good wages. There's nothing really to spend the money on because you can't buy cars. You can't buy significant major goods because all of these industries have turned towards supporting the war effort. And people are forced to save their money. When you get high wages and you're forced to save your money, people are on a very stable, very firm financial foothold for the first time in a decade in some cases. And so this whole civilian response we're going to talk about today is really how the Great Depression comes to an end. Now, I talked about employment, and I've already mentioned we go from a labor surplus with a significant portion of the population unemployed to a labor shortage. Obviously, the majority of people going into the military in the 1940s are men. And what that's going to do is that's going to, if we need to build airplanes and tanks and battleships and rifles and bullets and boots, we need someone to work in these jobs. So this is going to open up opportunities for women. Obviously, we have that Rosie the Riveter icon that is still a part of American popular culture today. Part of this is because the government under Roosevelt will set up the Fair Employment Practices Commission, and they'll issue Executive Order 8802. Executive Order 8802 means you cannot discriminate based on sex or race in the workplace if you wish to have a government contract. So if you want to have one of those really fat contracts to build airplanes, you're going to hire women, you're going to hire African Americans, you're going to hire Hispanics, you're going to hire any available laborer to work in your factories. Because if you don't, the government will actually strip you of your contract. One thing that's important to remember, if you have a skill, if you are an engineer, if you are a welder, if you are someone who has a highly technical background to your education and your skill set, you're actually going to be exempted from the draft. Not everybody volunteers, and it's not possible to get enough volunteers to fight a war of this size. And so the American military, almost instantly after Pearl Harbor, will reinstate the draft. Actually, on a limited basis, they had started drafting people in 1940, but that's the purview of a military history course. As I've said, these people are working for good pay. They're also working extremely long hours, 12 hours a day, 5 days, 6 days a week is fairly common, in some cases 7 days a week. They're making excellent money if you're working stateside as a welder or a mechanic or in any of these factories supporting the war effort. And so your life drastically financially improves because of employment for the war. What we also need to do on the state side is we need to get the message out to support the war effort. It's not automatic that everybody supports the war, and there are actually anti-war people throughout the United States throughout the Second World War that want the government out of the war, that this is none of our business, that we're isolated by two oceans and we don't need to be involved. So the government is going to develop propaganda on the home front in order to really encourage participation and support by the average citizen for what the government is doing. You're in essence you're encouraged to do your part. We have here a poster that is was actually painted by Norman Rockwell. It's a soldier at the front lines firing a machine gun. The script, let's give him enough and on time. Do your part at the factory. Work hard at the factory so that this man doesn't run out of ammunition. Don't fall behind in your production. It's a very powerful, moving message that your actions at home directly affect the lives of the soldiers on the front lines. And so iconic pictures and propaganda images like this will be rampant in American society. There's actually a version of this picture that has German text on it that was used in the Dakotas during the war years because of the number of German immigrants who lived in especially North Dakota that didn't speak English. So the government even worked to reach out to non-English speakers to promote their support of the war during these years. We have war bonds drives. Essentially, a war bond is a savings bond sold by the government that was a promissory note that if you buy this war bond, you're helping the government finance the war, and you will be paid back at a certain interest rate after the war ends. And so people invest that money that they can't spend anything else on into war bonds. This is partly how the government is going to support and pay for the Second World War. A lot of these war bond drives, they bring celebrities out to local communities. Hollywood goes to war. And Hollywood stars will go out with USO tours to visit troops at the front lines to bring them entertainment. They'll also go on tours stateside to promote people buying war bonds. We'll get some truly great pieces of American cinema that come out of this era to support the troops. Essentially, you are bombarded constantly with a message to support the war. And if you see, I have a couple of hot links on taxes and collecting fat. I'll post this PowerPoint as well as the lecture. If you click on those are a couple of Walt Disney cartoons that, again, you go to the movies on Saturday, it costs you a quarter to go in, it's your one form of entertainment, and you're getting newsreel news before the movie, but you're also getting a little Walt Disney short, and these shorts during the war years are telling you it's a little 3 to 5 to 10 minute cartoon before the feature. Here's how you can support the war by collecting fat, or here's why paying taxes are important when your nation's at war. And so I'll post those as well for you to be able to watch those cartoons. The other thing that we do, and this is a brilliant move by the Roosevelt administration, is America in the Second World War will come to exemplify what Roosevelt calls the 4 freedoms. And this is another reason that we need to be at war, because our enemies don't have these freedoms. They don't treat their people in a way that they have these freedoms. Norman Rockwell will work with the government and create these 4 iconic images, and we have the freedom of speech, exemplified by the man on the left standing up at a civic meeting, speaking his mind before the town. And if you notice, if you look at pictures of Abraham Lincoln without the beard, the gentleman speaking looks an awful lot like him. So we have a call to America's past. We have freedom from want, the Sunday table or the Thanksgiving table where everybody gathers together and there's enough food for everyone. Even coming out of the Depression, this speaks so much to the average American about how every person has the human right to live with dignity and to live without the fear of where their next meal is coming from. The freedom of prayer, the freedom of religion, that every man, woman, and child in this world has the right to practice their own religion as they see fit. And finally, and perhaps one of the most touching ones, is is here on the bottom right, freedom from fear. A father and mother are tucking their two children into bed at night. And what you can't see, what you can't make out in the painting, if you see a much larger image, you can read the headlines on the newspaper, and it's the newspaper is filled with accounts of war and bombing and death and the death of civilians. And imagine tucking your children in while the world is at war. Pardon me, that's Courage, the history wonder dog growling. Able to tuck your children at night without the fear that they're going to be killed, without the fear of death at every corner. It's something that we perhaps, especially in this country, take for granted. And especially during a wartime where Europe and the Pacific Islands are being ravaged and millions of civilians are dying overseas, civilians at home are safe. And imagine the power of that message, the power of that painting of the freedom from fear as something that we need to extend to the rest of this world by supporting the war and winning it. All right, as I've said, we have a real need for resources in order to support the war effort. So scrap drives are going to be very, very popular during the Second World War. It's going to be, that again, Courage, the history wonder dog, has decided to disrupt lecture because somebody's walking 300 yards away. Okay, so scrap drives. Essentially, this is the first big push in American culture for recycling, that we don't have enough of these resources to go around, so we need to save what we have. People will actually put their cars up on blocks and take the tires off their cars for these scrap drives. Now, part of the reason is we can't naturally produce rubber in the United States. Rubber plants grow in tropical climates, especially in the Pacific Islands. And so natural sources of rubber have been cut off because they're under Japanese isolation. So we need tires. Think of the myriad thousands of things that there are little bits of rubber in your life, shoe soles and elastic and any number of things that are needed to help support the war effort. Rubber is a great example. We have a scrap rubber pile here represented, but paper is needed for packaging goods, for military forms, for the 1,000 different things that paper and cardboard are used for. Tin for canteens and mess kits and forks and knives and helmets and bullets. And again, these are all going to be used for military goods. You would have patriotic scrap drives in your town, and on a certain day, kids would go around and they would take, literally, you can find newsreels and images of kids going around with their little red wagons filled with tin and paper and rubber and anything they could get their hands on in order to take them and turn these into scrap drives to support the war effort. A great example is Lucky Strike cigarettes. In the night prior to 1941, Lucky Strike cigarettes, and I know none of us smoke because smoking's bad, but prior to 1941, Lucky Strike cigarettes came in a green paper label with a red dot in the middle. The green color was needed for Army uniforms and to dye materials for the war effort. In order to be patriotic, Lucky Strikes stopped using green in their cigarette wrap packages, and they went to the iconic all-white package that they have even today if you look behind the counter at the gas station. And this was not only a patriotic attempt on the company's part to help the war effort, they advertised off of this. Lucky Strikes goes to war was one of their advertising slogans because of the new iconic white packaging. So rationing and scrap drives affected every aspect of American culture. As I just said, rationing. So what is rationing? We can only produce so much agriculturally, and there is an understanding that we need to conserve all goods, especially consumable goods, to help support the war effort. The Office of Price Administration is going to be created. This is going to establish fair wartime prices on scarce goods. They're also going to create ration tickets. We have a little illustration here, how to shop with your ration tokens. You can only buy certain goods with a certain amount of ration stamps as well as cash. In other words, if you wanted to buy gasoline, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, we have the A stamp and the B stamp. If you wanted to go buy gasoline, you needed to register with the government what your job was, how far you had to drive, and then there was a government board that determined if your job or if your lifestyle was worthy of a certain amount of gas. The people who got the largest amount of gasoline, the A stamp, were generally war workers, physicians, people who legitimately needed to drive long distances. So you would get that sticker and you would put it in the lower left-hand corner of your windshield, and when you drove into the gas station, that would tell the attendant how much gasoline you were able to buy. Sometimes you could only buy a couple of gallons a week. Sometimes with an A stamp, you could get a full tank of gas anytime you needed it. But it all depended on how far you lived from work and how vital your job was. If you wanted to go to the grocery store and buy butter, you had to have enough stamps saved up to be able to buy butter along with cash. And you actually received these coupon tokens, these ration coupons, in the mail from the government every month. You received one for every person in the household. You might receive more if you worked for the war effort because your health and energy and ability to eat was more vital than other people's. And it sounds overarching and menacing, but again, we had 10 million people overseas fighting this war, and we needed to provide high quality food in stockpiles for our soldiers overseas. We're also developing new foods for our soldiers overseas that is high energy, high sugar, high output, to be able to enable them to uh, perform high caloric output due to the food that they were eating. I think even today, the modern MRE is 2,000, 2,100 calories per meal. And you're only really supposed to take in 2,000 calories a day as the average person, with the understanding that a person in a combat situation is expending more calories um, than the average person at home. So you needed to save ration stamps in order to buy. I have a list of goods here. Plus, there were some days that you would go to the store. It's Wheatless Wednesdays. You couldn't buy wheat on Wednesdays, or Meatless Mondays. Plan a vegetarian meal on Monday so that there's enough meat to be sent overseas to feed our troops. This was a patriotic call for every American to do their part in every aspect of their life to support the war effort. Importantly, we also need to talk about issues of race that take place during the Second World War. Most famously, because of Executive Order 9066, Japanese Americans are rounded up from the West Coast and they are sent to internment camps where they will live for the next 2 years, 3 years. They are continuing to round people up through 1944. They're rounded up by soldiers and forced to abandon their homes, abandon their jobs, abandon most of their possessions in every case, and they are put in internment camps in the center of America, in New Mexico, Colorado, the Dakotas, um, Wyoming. These are not attempts to create communities that mirror the average American community that these people have come from. This is military barrack housing in deserts and away from other major cities. People are put here because of their race. Japanese Americans are isolated because of the color of their skin. No matter how many generations they had lived in this country, no matter how well they spoke English, no matter what their job was, the American government sent soldiers to your home. You are allowed to take a limited number of items per person, usually a couple of suitcases with your clothes, and you were then packed up on trucks and sent to these internment camps. This is a response to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. It's also an incredibly racist response that you can't trust anybody of Japanese origin or Japanese descent. We did not do this with Germans. We did not do this with Italians. The Nisei, or Japanese Americans, complied. They knew that they understood, I'm not sure the best way to put this. They tried to fight the order through the courts, and ultimately the Supreme Court ordered that this was a legal maneuver by the federal government. In order to show that they were patriotic Americans, they went to these camps. It is something we should never have called upon them to do. It is something we should never do again. And there's such a push to show a support for the war effort that we get the 442nd Combat Team. We get an entire infantry regiment raised out of Japanese Americans raised in these internment camps that volunteer for the U.S. Army. They send them to Europe because they don't believe that they can actually trust them to fight in the Pacific. That's how racist this dogma, this belief is in the United States. If a person is of Japanese descent, if they look Asian, you cannot trust them. Even though the 442nd will produce multiple Medal of Honor winners, one of them, Daniel Inouye, he's died in the past couple of years. He won the Medal of Honor. He lost his arm in battle in the European Theater of Operations. Won the Medal of Honor for it. He was a direct volunteer. He was born and raised in Hawaii. He was moved to a mainland internment camp. He eventually became a senator from Hawaii and served most of his life representing the people of that state. He won the Medal of Honor. Another famous Japanese American who was interred, George Takei. He's more famous for his Facebook interactions today, but Mr. Sulu on Star Trek was a Japanese American who grew up in one of these internment camps. That's one situation of what one ethnic group in America had to deal with. Another one is the Double V campaign. African American civil rights activists began what they called the Double V campaign. Double victory. Victory at home, victory abroad. African Americans were going to do everything they could to support the war effort. They volunteered, even though the United States military was still segregated during the Second World War. They were finally allowed to be officers, but African Americans still served under white leadership and mostly in rear unit operations. They drove supply trucks, they cooked, they were clerks. Very few African American units were allowed active duty combat on the front lines. Yes, there's the Tuskegee Airmen, and there was one armored unit in Patton's army that was all African American. But by and large, African Americans served a support role. But the Double V campaign stated that we're going to fight as hard as we can to support this war effort and to win freedom for the world overseas. And because of that, they will recognize our work, they will recognize our worthiness, and we will finally earn a full standing in American society. Because we're just a few years removed from the end of sharecropping in the 1940s, folks. And there are still large swaths of the South where African Americans could not vote. They lived in segregated neighborhoods. They went to segregated schools. And the hope, the entire hope behind the Double V campaign is if we prove worthiness, we will be able to be we'll be recognized as full citizens at last, and nothing happens of it. The Double V campaign is a complete failure. Finally, I want to talk about braceros. Essentially, braceros are the beginning of Hispanic migrant labor in the United States. Again, 10 million people are in the military. We need someone to pick our crops. We need someone to do the agricultural labor to feed the civilians and the soldiers in the army. And so the government will begin this bracero program where they will recruit Hispanic workers to come up from Mexico and Central America to work in the agricultural fields of the American West in order to ensure that we can get these crops in and produce enough food and fiber to win the war. Unfortunately, braceros are going to be treated incredibly poorly. Imagine living in Montana in tents in the middle of winter. There are several documented cases of incredibly poor living conditions like that because the government's providing cheap labor, but people also want to make sure that they make a profit on things. So they're not housing their workers in good conditions. And the bracero program, honestly, will run through the 1950s to ensure that we have cheap labor in America's agricultural marketplace. All right, folks, that's the end. I really want to thank you very much. Like I said, I'm going to post those cartoons very shortly in order for you to be able to take a look at them. That's going to be our exercise for this week. I'm going to start a message board post. I want you guys to watch those cartoons and give me your thoughts on them because when I was growing up, it was a little easier to see or to find the World War II era cartoons, even running on TV still, but they're not as easy to find these days. So I'd like to get your guys' thoughts on what you see in these propaganda cartoons and have a conversation with you, especially amongst your peers, about what these cartoons mean and what they say. Do you even think that they were effective propaganda? Let me know. I hope everybody has a great week. Next week, we're going to talk about the 50s. We're going to get you guys ready for the exam, and we're going to talk about post-war America. Hope you guys have a great day.